I begin with an audio clip. You may recognize the voices.
Jazz is mistakes. You're playing a song wrong.
You're playing it wrong.
You're playing it wrong.
You can get a degree in how to play it wrong.
Jazz is an accident.
Waiting to happen.
Yes. Waiting to have happened.
This hilarious assessment of jazz comes from an interview with the satirical rock group Spinal Tap. Obviously, this is not my perspective, and it's probably not yours either if you clicked on this video. If you're new to the channel, my name is Chase Sanborn, and I'm a jazz trumpet player based in Toronto. Accordingly, I'm also a jazz fan. I think the reason I love Spinal Tap and other films that are in that mockumentary vein is that much of the dialogue is improvised, which makes them akin to jazz. You never know what's going to come out next. Now here's another clip from one of my favorite movie scenes about the nature of jazz. In Mr. Holland's opus, Richard Dreyfuss plays a musician who's struggling with his job as a high school music teacher. In this scene, his wife tells him that she's pregnant, and then she bursts into tears when she sees his reaction. In his attempt to console, he relates a story about the first time he heard a John Coltrane record.
He handed me this album one day, and it was John Coltrane. So I took it home and I put it on the machine, and I hated it. I mean, I really hated it. I just didn't get it. So I played it again, and I played it again, and then I just couldn't stop playing it.
In a scene from my own life, I'm pretty much the only jazz fan in my entire extended family. At a holiday gathering one year, I put on Bill Evans in the background, thinking that no one could object to that music. But before we got through the second tune, my sister, who is decidedly not a jazz fan, expressed her exasperation with having to listen to what she described as mosquito jazz. Now, I both laugh and cry that something which is so enrichingly beautiful to me can be perceived by somebody else as the equivalent of an annoying insect. Truthfully, I suspect that for a lot of people, jazz does sound like a bunch of mistakes, applauded as genius by an audience that Charles Mingus would have berated for trying too hard to be hip. To the person who's attuned not only to the sound of jazz, but the spirit of jazz music, what sounds like mistakes to someone else who's less attuned might be heard as creative choices that take the listener, and possibly the musician, to unexpectedly wonderful places. Now, that's not to say that there are no actual mistakes in jazz. We're on a tightrope, making decisions in real time about what notes to play or not to play. Sometimes we jig when we should have jogged. But a quick-thinking jazz musician can find a way to make any note work, even if it wasn't intentional. I've often quoted Miles Davis, who said, "It's the note you play next that determines whether it's right or wrong." In that light, a mistake can actually be seen as an opportunity. It could lead you to play something that you otherwise wouldn't think to play, point you in a new direction. We all develop established patterns, things that we tend to repeat, like melodic phrases or rhythmic motifs. It can actually be a blessing in disguise if we're thrown off the familiar track and have to find another melodic pathway. For the jazz listener, the appeal is in the spontaneity, where no one, not even the musicians, knows precisely what comes next. Thinking about the way that jazz musicians interact, we could borrow a phrase from the tech world. If this, then that. If you play this, then I'll play that. We could also compare it to a debate. Making your points requires knowledge and skill, but the art comes in the way you counter the opposing viewpoints. Just as in music, the ability and the willingness to listen and respond are key factors in winning the debate. We realize that a musical performance shouldn't have winners and losers. We're all on the same team working towards a common goal. But there is an element of challenge in jazz as we push each other towards new ground. It's probably more of a personal challenge in that I'm pushing myself more than I'm trying to push the other musicians, but one thing leads to the other. With jazz, as with other art forms, the greater the depth of understanding, the more intense your enjoyment may be, as a listener or as a performer. If I hear a piece of music that I love, that stimulates the pleasure center in my brain in a way that few other things can do. It's an affirmation, and it's kept me in this game all my life. The challenge to the jazz educator is to communicate and emphasize the fun of improvising, the reward that comes from doing the work that'll get you into the game. It's a lot for sure, but when you can do it, it's a gas. So how do you feel about this? What does jazz mean to you? What do you like or dislike about it? Let me know that in the comments. And while you're at it, please click the like button, and thank you. I find that jazz students are often fearful that they'll violate one of the rules and they'll play a wrong note, the dreaded mistake. But if Spinal Tap are to be taken at their word, that's the whole point of jazz. I jest, of course, and I can hear Fred Willard saying just that. The goal of jazz, of course, is not to play mistakes, but to approach the music with a sense of adventure and a willingness to take chances. The audience doesn't go to a jazz concert expecting to hear perfection. They go to hear musicians react in the spur of the moment. In some ways, it's more about the process than the end result, and the fear of making a mistake inhibits the process. I mean, what's the worst that can happen if you really screw up during a jazz performance?
Missed it by that much.
Yes, you may wind up with a bruised ego, but that's the extent of the physical damage. Even though, in the words of Garrison Keillor,
of the people who've keeled over dead at orchestra concerts, most of them were killed by a long trumpet passage, and most of them were glad to go.
Now, Garrison also said about the trumpet, there's an instrument on which one can embarrass themselves. Given that truth, one of the things that I love about jazz is that it's okay to make a mistake, just like a swing and a miss in sports. It's not the goal, but it's part of the game. What if things went so wrong during a jazz performance that the band actually has to stop and restart? I've seen it happen. I think that would be considered a disaster in a classical concert, but in jazz, as long as you're able to laugh it off, the audience will too. It might even enhance their experience to see that you are operating on that tightrope where anything could happen. Admittedly, if you did that several times in a row, the audience might begin to think that perhaps a bit of rehearsal prior to the concert would have been a good idea. But ultimately, they are there to see a work in progress. And that's how we should see ourselves, too, as human beings and as musicians. Sometimes even both.